I thank the Prime Minister. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. It's 10 years since Kevin Rudd's historic national apology to the stolen generations. It's more than 20 years after the Bringing Them Home report. So will the Prime Minister join with Labor and commit to establishing a compensation scheme for the few remaining survivors of the stolen generation within Commonwealth jurisdictions?
Yeah. The Prime Minister has the call.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition, when he spoke in response to my tabling of the Closing the Gap report, said that he believed there were 150 surviving members of the stolen generations. Our advice is that there are, in fact, up to 500. So I just note that point. We noted his commitment that he made. We commissioned some work by the Healing Foundation to inform the government on how best to support surviving victims of the stolen generations and their families. And as the honourable member understands, we're committed to doing things with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, not doing things to them. So that the report will be due in April, and we will be considering that, and obviously with the advice of our Indigenous Advisory Committee and other Indigenous leaders, as we demonstrated last week at the special gathering, we'll be considering that report and then forming a response. But I understand the spirit in which the honourable member made the commitment, but I trust he understands that, as we've seen with refreshing the Closing the Gap targets, it's taking a few months longer than I would have preferred. But the important thing is that we do things with Indigenous Australians, not do things to them, and that's been one of the criticisms of the first set of targets. We've taken that on board, and the next set are going to be the result of very careful consultation. Thank you.
The member for Brisbane.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House how lower business taxes will help create jobs and grow wages for Australians, including in my electorate of Brisbane? And is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the honourable member for his question, and note his experience and hard work for small businesses. He understands the importance of small and family businesses, of which there are over 30,000 actually in his own electorate of Brisbane, and these are businesses that are benefiting from our small and medium business tax cuts. They're benefiting right now, and they're investing more and they're employing more, and that's why we've seen 403,000 jobs created last year, a quarter of them in Queensland, in fact, Mr Speaker, and 42,500 of that 100,000 new jobs in Queensland going to young people. 60% of the new jobs created last year were taken up by women, and that's why we've got a record level of female participation. So the big difference between the government's policies and those of the opposition's on this score is the opposition doesn't have one policy that will encourage one business to invest $1 or employ one new person. And they don't even, when I make that challenge, they don't even offer one. They feel they don't need to. They seem to overlook the fact that 90% of Australians work in the private sector, and it is and the businesses that are benefiting from the tax cuts which the parliament has already approved and which are in operation, and the last tranche of those already approved will start on July 1, companies with turnovers of up to $50 million. Those companies, not giants, overwhelmingly Australian-owned family businesses, they employ half of the private sector workforce, in fact a little more. So that is the big difference. We know that it is the enterprise, the imagination, the commitment, the confidence of private Australian businesses that are creating the jobs and the opportunities Australians need. And that's why every policy we have is focused on encouraging that. Now, a year or so ago, the honourable member opposite, the Leader of the Opposition, said 2017 was going to be all about jobs, 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 but he came up with not one policy that would encourage one job. I see the member for Chifley interjecting there that jobs are being created in his electorate because of the government's policies. And the government is committed to infrastructure, including Western Sydney Airport, which will create tens of thousands of jobs, a project he furiously opposed. They need better representation than that, and what they have from the government is a commitment to creating the opportunity, the investment and the jobs that Australians need.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Barton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. An estimated 17,664 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were living in out-of-home care last year, compared with 9,070 when Kevin Rudd issued the apology to the stolen generations a decade ago. Will the Prime Minister join Labor in convening a national summit on First Nations children to urgently address the alarming numbers of Indigenous children living in out-of-home care, away from family, community and culture?
The member's time has concluded. The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I think, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for a question, and despite our occasional differences here in the House, I want to pay respect to the honourable member for the extraordinary role model she provides as a first Aboriginal woman elected to the House of Representatives, of course sitting opposite the Minister for Indigenous Health, Ken Wyatt, if I may be forgiven for using his name, the first Aboriginal man to be elected to the House of Representatives. Look, this, again, the opposition has proposed to have a summit on this matter. We obviously we are consulting more thoroughly and comprehensively than ever before. When Chris Sara said to me at a football match, Mr Speaker, I might say originally, that we've got to do things with Indigenous Australians, not to them, it absolutely cut through. He was dead right. That is what we have to do, and we need to engage more and consult more, and we've done that. And I just say, in terms of what the honourable member raised, all suggestions gratefully received. We've just had a special gathering here. I look forward to doing more. The critical thing is to get as much power and authority and accountability, as well informed as possible, as I said in my remarks earlier today, and devolved to as local as a position as possible. In other words, to make sure the people who are closest to the problems and the challenges are most empowered to deal with them and ensure that the funds and the resources and so forth that government provides are best employed. But I'll consider the honourable member's question, but I just want to thank her for the spirit in which she asked it.
Just before I call the honourable member for Ford, I'd like to inform the House that we have present in the gallery this afternoon the Minister of Foreign Trade of Peru, Mr Eduardo Ferreros, and delegation. On behalf of the House, I welcome you and your colleagues. The member for Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on the government's actions to ease the tax burden on Australian business and how it is helping to drive jobs and growth in the Australian economy? And how does this compare with alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Ford for his question. This side of the House believes in a lower tax burden on the Australian economy. That's why we're committed to ensuring that the tax burden doesn't rise above 23.9% of the economy over the medium term. We're committed to that. The opposition is opposed to that. They will allow taxes to rise endlessly as they propose to do. But when it comes to the issue of corporate tax, our position is very, very straightforward. It's a very simple proposition. If you want businesses to pay workers more, you don't force them to pay the government more. It's pretty simple. If you want businesses to spend more on employing more Australians, you don't force them to spend more on higher taxes being paid to the government. If you want businesses to reinvest their earnings in their businesses so they can grow and expand and earn consistently higher profits so they can pay their workers more. You don't force them to hand over more of their earnings to the government in higher taxes. Now, that's not a theory. That's just common sense, Mr Speaker. Common sense that doesn't escape those on this side of the House, or the member for Ford in particular, but has completely escaped the opposition, Mr Speaker, who have lost their compass when it comes to managing the economy, and they're stumbling around in this wilderness, Mr Speaker, of economic policy, in a place that many years ago they used to have what they referred to as their giants in Hawke and Keating. They wouldn't be recognised in the Labor Party these days, Mr Speaker. They would not be recognised. The Labor Party is about as useful to the economic debate in these times, Mr Speaker, as a pig shearing competition. Lots of squealing and no wool, Mr Speaker. That's the contribution that has been made by the Labor Party when it comes to these issues. But, Mr Speaker, the companies themselves have made it very clear in trying to get these simple points across. Wesfarmers Chief Executive, incoming Woodside Chairman Richard Goyder stated, "I don't think business are going to have any option but to use some of the benefits of any tax reduction into paying more for people." Very clear. Business are making it very clear. BHP CEO Andrew Mackenzie has said we would invest more. He said if the Senate agreed to reduce the corporate tax rate, it would make a strong contribution to Australian economic growth. You could see changes in a matter of months. The Labor Party is standing between a wage rise and Australian workers, Mr Speaker. It is the Labor Party's policy to force governments to pay more, Mr Speaker, rather than let those same companies pay their employees more, Mr Speaker. They have lost their economic compass. They have lost their way, Mr Speaker. I suggest they watch the Hawke retrospective. They might learn a thing or two about what Labor's economic policy used to be and no longer resembles.
Members on my left, the member for Chifley. The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Under Section 12 of the Members of Parliament Staff Act, the Prime Minister alone can approve the allocation of staff to a member or senator. So was the Prime Minister or his office involved in approving the creation of a new position last year in either the office of Minister Canavan or the office of the then Nationals Whip?
The Prime Minister has the
Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr Speaker, I'm advised that the Nationals are provided with a number of personal staff positions as a share of the government's overall staffing pool. The distribution of those staff members between Nationals offices is a matter for the National Party. I'm further advised that at no time did the Nationals fill all vacant staffing positions. Now, as for the staffing moves between the offices the honourable member referred to, the Deputy Prime Minister addressed this in a statement on the 10th of February, in which he said that he had not discussed Ms Campion's employment with me or my office. He confirmed that the Nationals were responsible for decisions relating to staffing in the offices of Nationals members, as I just said, and that the Prime Minister's office has an administrative role in informing the Department of Finance of changes.
The member for Denison.
Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, Department of Human Services ICT jobs are being shed in Hobart despite an assurance from the government that this would not occur. Indeed, I'm told that whenever an ICT specialist moves to another role, the department doesn't refill the position, and that staff have been told that at the end of their current assignments they'll be deployed elsewhere. In other words, the government is reneging on its promise by stealth. Prime Minister, will you commit to stop this shedding of Hobart ICT jobs, and do you give an assurance more broadly that the government will maintain at least the current number of public service jobs in Hobart?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you. I thank the honourable member for his question. The government recognises the importance of a strong and responsive public service. Ultimately, the role of the public service is to deliver services for the public as efficiently as possible, and that's why we're constantly looking for ways to improve the quality of services delivered by the public service, including through our commitment to digital transformation. Now, in relation to the Department of Human Services Hobart ICT staff, I am advised that these employees are currently responsible for supporting the work of the National Disability Insurance Agency, including help desk work. As to the member's assertion that staff would be redeployed elsewhere after their current assignments, I can assure the member for Denison that the Minister's Department, that's the Department of Human Services, will continue to offer these employees a position within that department, including opportunities for being positioned in Hobart, ensuring that people can stay in their hometown. I'd also add that the staffing profile of the Department of Human Services in Tasmania is substantial, at 1,904 employees across the state, according to its last annual report. And the government, the honourable member I'm sure agrees, is absolutely committed to ensuring all Tasmanians get the services they need. And I just note, before I conclude, the honourable member, that last year 7,700 new jobs were created in Tasmania. Tasmania is seeing strong economic growth. The
Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Denison on a point of order.
Speaker, on relevance, the question had two parts. The second was to do with whether any broader assurance could be given about federal public service jobs in Hobart.
Will resume his seat. The Prime Minister, the question did have two parts, but the Prime Minister is completely in order. He's able to address them in whichever way he wishes.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. 7,700 new jobs in Tasmania is of the greatest relevance to the families in Tasmania who have one of whose members has won one of those jobs. And I would note, in conclusion, that the Tasmania is seeing strong economic growth. It's seeing it in large part based on the trade deals negotiated by the coalition, particularly the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. It will be a big beneficiary of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP-11, and indeed, I'm sure, will benefit from the Free Trade Agreement with Peru that we are about to sign with the honourable minister who's in the public gallery. And finally, I would note, Mr Speaker, that there are 49,800 small and medium businesses in Tasmania benefiting from the government's tax cuts to small and medium businesses, overwhelmingly Australian-owned, overwhelmingly family businesses.
The member for Capricornia.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on the government's commitment to building water infrastructure in central Queensland and how it will generate jobs for hard-working Australians in my electorate of Capricornia? Is he aware of any alternative policies?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for Capricornia for the question, and ultimately we know how important Rookwood Weir is. And it was great to have the Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk down the other day to confirm that they too now believe in Rookwood Weir, and this is a great step forward. We know that over the course of time this will bring billions of dollars more revenue back to central Queensland and employ thousands more people. It's part of the nation's overall water strategy, which is also present in Tasmania, where we are seeing substantial water infrastructure built under the Hodgman government in combination with the federal government. It's also part of the same water infrastructure which is building the McAllister irrigation pipeline for the dairy area there, as well as the Wimmera-Mallee pipeline, which is also of a great assistance to the member for Mallee. We want to continue on this water infrastructure program. In Queensland alone, we have substantial feasibility studies that are underway, and we are making sure that we expand the capacity of that nation to generate further wealth from dams and water infrastructure. This government, with the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, has its focus on water infrastructure. We are fully aware that, that dams are the essence of how we actually drive the economy forward. And you can see in places such as St George, where I lived for quite some time in the member for Maranoa's seat, how a dry acre, which was worth between $200 or $300 an acre, went up to around about $12,000 to $13,000 an acre with the addition of water. This shows how you can actually grow an economy with the same stock of land. But it requires a government that is not scared of building water infrastructure. In this nation, we will be taken to further water infrastructure as the megalitre per person requirements increase and the per megalitre storage per person reduces. We have, in this nation, lived off the back of water infrastructure from people in the past who have had the vision and the foresight to actually build it. People such as Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen when he built Wivenhoe Dam, which at the time everybody said was too big. Now they say is too small. We will continue to drive for further water infrastructure in places such as North Queensland, and there are a number of programs on the table as we speak. We will continue on this process because we know that is how you generate jobs, that is how you build wealth, and that is something that I think is an exceptional part of what the vision of this nation's government.
The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Special Minister of State. I refer to the Prime Minister's answer just now. Which minister or office in the government approved the creation of a new position last year in either the office of Minister Canavan or the office of the then Nationals Whip? And will the government release the documents relating to the creation of those positions?
The Treasurer representing the Special Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I refer the member to the Prime Minister's response because he made it very clear that these are matters that are dealt with by the National Party. Thank you.
The member for Fisher.
My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the Minister update the House on the government's defence export strategy and the opportunities which are available in the United Kingdom? How does the government's commitment to trade and other measures help grow the economy, wages and jobs?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Fisher for his question. Mr Speaker, today and last night I had the opportunity to meet with the UK Secretary of Defence, Gavin Williamson. Our defence industry relationship with the United Kingdom has improved markedly in the last couple of years. We've initiated the United Kingdom-Australia Defence Industry Dialogue for the first time. I had the first couple of meetings and it will meet for a third time in the first half of this year, Mr Speaker. There are real opportunities for Australian businesses to export their defence platforms into the United Kingdom. There's a few examples that are well known to members, like the Thales Australia's Bushmaster, which is currently bidding for a tender into the UK but has already been purchased by the UK before, the member for Bendigo's Electorate, CEA's phased array radar, produced here in Canberra, which is being currently evaluated for the United Kingdom's Type 31E platform for frigates, and BAE and the Defence Science and Technology Group's NOLCA, which is an anti-ship missile decoy, which has passed now $1 billion worth of value for exports from Australia around the world. And the smaller companies too. In fact, the member for Fisher's Electorate, Presidium Global, is currently trying to break into the UK market with an unmanned ground vehicle for defence personnel out in the field, Mr Speaker. So the defence export strategy that the Prime Minister and I launched in January is just one of the ways that we are assisting Australian businesses trying to break in the defence exports market. Another one, of course, is the reduction of the company tax rate, Mr Speaker, a very important economic measure that will drive jobs, higher wages, investment and growth in the economy. Mr Speaker, it wasn't so long ago that the Leader of the Opposition was in fact in favour of company tax cuts. In 2011, Mr Speaker, in 2011 he was the Assistant Treasurer in the Gillard government, and in March 2011 he gave a speech to ACOS's National Conference. In it he said, lowering the corporate rate for smaller businesses only, as the Greens propose, so that was when he wanted to have different policies to the Greens as opposed to now, Mr Speaker, creates an artificial incentive for Australian businesses to downsize. Again, someone calls out boring, Mr Speaker, from the Labor Party. Don't you think it's amazing, as the Treasurer was talking before, the legacy of the Hawke-Keating government, was to have economic credibility, to put behind them the Whitlam legacy, The modus operandi of this opposition, Mr Speaker, is not to care about economic credibility whatsoever, Mr Speaker. They've embraced Chavez and Guevara and they've rejected Hawke and Keating.
The member for Isaacs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Special Minister of State. I refer to the Treasurer's answer just now, in which he stated that the National Party approved the creation of a new position last year in either the office of Minister Canavan or the office of the Nationals Whip. I asked the Treasurer which National Party minister was he referring to, and if he doesn't know, will he find out and report back to the House before the end of question time?
The member for Gilmore will cease interjecting. The Treasurer has
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, first of all, I made no such suggestion about an additional position. That was the assertion made by the member. So that is not something I've commented on, and nor does the government go along with the assertion that the member has put forward. But these matters are addressed by the Leader of the National Party.
The member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question.
The member for Canning will resume his seat. I regularly warn the member for Bruce I'm not going to have him continually interject. He can leave under 94A. That'll solve that problem. And the member for Canning has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on action the government is taking to keep Australians safe? And why is it important that we have a consistent approach to national security?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for his question and acknowledge the work that he does in chairing the Committee on Intelligence and Security in his parliament. He does great bipartisan work with some of those opposite, and I acknowledge the work of that committee. Mr Speaker, as all Australians saw in the news last week, there was a terrible incident that took place in Melbourne. Sadly, it's not the first terrorist-related incident to take place in Melbourne or obviously in our country. A 24-year-old woman has been charged with a terrorism offence following a stabbing at Mill Park. And whilst those matters will probably be investigated and that matter is before the court, in a general sense, Mr Speaker, it allows us an opportunity to pause and reflect on the influence, particularly down the line into the minds of young people, ISIL has, not just in our country but around the world. And we need to recognise that this scourge is with us and with us for a long period of time. The Department of Home Affairs, the construct put together by the Prime Minister before Christmas, allows all of our intelligence and security agencies to come together to work in the most effective fashion and to work very closely with our state colleagues. I want to acknowledge the work of the Victorian Joint Counter-Terrorism Team for their dedication, not only last week but around the clock, in trying to keep Victorians safe. They work very closely with the Australian Federal Police, with ASIO, with our other agencies, to make sure that we can give ourselves the best chance of defeating the scourge of terrorism. It's worth pointing out to the House, Mr Speaker, that since the 12th of September 2014, when the national terrorism threat level was raised to probable, 85 people have been charged as a result of 36 counter-terrorism-related operations around the country. There have sadly, tragically, been 6 attacks and 14 major counter-terrorism disruption operations in response to potential planning in this country. I want to praise the work of all of our federal and state agencies. The government has committed a record amount of funding into the intelligence and security agencies, and we will continue to do everything within our power to make sure that we can keep Australians safe, particularly those that would gather in places such as shopping centres and movie theatres, as we've seen in incidents around the world. There is a lot of work that goes on around the clock that Australians aren't aware of. That work keeps us safe, and this government will always continue to support that work so that we can have every effort in keeping the Australian public safe.
Yeah. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question's to the Prime Minister. Next week the Prime Minister will be overseas. Will the Deputy Prime Minister be acting Prime Minister in his absence? Does the Prime Minister still retain confidence in his Deputy Prime Minister?
Members on both sides, the Prime Minister has the call.
Yes, in response to both questions.
The member for Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the minister outline to the House the benefits of the coalition government's trade agenda and what our agreements mean for the nation's economic growth, as well as the creation of jobs for hard-working Australians? Is the minister aware of any risks to those benefits?
The Minister for Trade and Investment.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Gilmore for her question. Yet another member of the coalition that is resolutely focused on creating export opportunities for Australian businesses, resolutely focused on boosting Australia's economic growth, resolutely focused on creating employment opportunities for Australians, all delivered through this coalition government's strong commitment to opening up markets globally and to making sure that we create the best possible opportunities, in particular for Australia's small to medium-sized enterprises. I want to also welcome Minister Ferros. It's great to have you join us in the public gallery. Minister Ferros and I were very pleased to be able to sign this morning the Peru-Australia Free Trade Agreement. This has been one of the fastest concluded FTA agreements in Australia's history. And today we are, as a result of this deal, ensuring Australian businesses have access to one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. Peru, with its 31 million people, has had an average annual growth rate of 5.9% over the last 10 years, much higher standards of living, and that's what we'll be able to tap into together in a deal that's going to be good for Australia and good for Peru. It is, of course, building on the work of the coalition with respect to what we did with the North Asian powerhouse economies of China, Korea and Japan. Again, all agreements driving employment growth and economic growth here in this country. And let's never forget that it was the Australian Labor Party that stood opposed to the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. It was the Australian Labor Party that condoned the disgraceful multi-million-dollar campaign from the trade union movement against the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. But this deal that we've put in place now with Peru, likewise with the TPP-11, we're doing despite the Australian Labor Party. But you know, the problem is that we've seen evidence time and time again where this Leader of the Opposition says one thing to one audience and a different thing to another audience. Because I was reading the Daily Telegraph and I saw this headline from last year, "I'm at war with business, Bill Shorten." And he went along to the BCA and he was talking to the BCA about their candidate in Batman. And they was asked about Jed Carney, and this is what he said about Jed Carney. He said not to worry about her, quote, "she's hopeless." That's his remarks about Jed Carney. She's hopeless. So when he talks to the BCA, he says about their candidate in Batman that she's hopeless. But when he's out there in Batman, he'll say, "Oh, don't worry about what I said in the business chamber. Get right behind Jed Carney. She's got a great, bold vision for Australia." The fact is, the Australian people have the measure of this man. They know that what he says in the boardrooms is very different to what he says in the electorate, and we know the truth. The truth is what he says about Jed Carney. She is hopeless, and he's a hopeless Leader of the Opposition.
Members on both sides. The Treasurer, the Minister for Defence Industry. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Victoria is the fastest-growing state in the nation. It is home to 1 in 4 Australians. So why is Victoria only receiving 9.7% of the federal infrastructure budget in 2017-18 budget?
Just before I call the Deputy Prime Minister, the member for Deakin. The member for Deakin will cease interjecting. The member for Latrobe. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member, the Leader of the Opposition, for his question. And it was interesting this morning we were going through the briefing on Victoria. And it's always such a shame that when $1.5 billion is offered to Victoria, they rejected it. Obviously, on the road east from Melbourne, where this money was supposed to be spent, they decided not to spend it. Instead, they chose to spend it on the Monash Freeway. And of course, on the expenditure on the Monash Freeway, that was not actually the terms and conditions. So when we have a government in Victoria that wishes to actually negotiate with us in a proper form, in good faith, for what is actually the initial agreement, then we have a much better capacity to deliver the infrastructure that's required. Now, whilst we are on the subject, I think it is very important to discuss other major infrastructure projects for Victoria, such as the Inland Rail. The Inland Rail, which is a corridor of commerce from Melbourne, which is definitely in Victoria, through Wodonga up to Brisbane. Now, you think that with such a major piece of infrastructure as that, for which a huge beneficiary would be Victoria, that the Australian Labor Party, led by yourself, the good member from Maribyrnong, would put money on the table for it. But of course, they haven't. They don't believe in the Inland Rail. They put no money on the table for the Inland Rail. As far as they have gone, it's to say that it is a useful idea. Well, there are many useful ideas, but it's not a useful idea that's going to actually pay for a cheque. You have no money on the table for the Inland Rail. You have no vision for our nation. And on the dams process, you are going to take that money off the table. And here comes the new leader of the Labor.
The members on my left. Members on my left. Has the Deputy Prime Minister concluded his answer? The member for Grainler will resume his seat. We're going to the next question. The member for Grainler will resume his seat. The member for Grey has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Energy. Will the Minister update the House on the action the government is taking to improve energy affordability and reliability so that local businesses in South Australia, like the Portside Hotel in Port Pirie, in my electorate, can grow and create more jobs?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Grey for his question. Know that he, like the other members from South Australia on this side of the House, the member for Barker, the member for Boothby, the member for Sturt, are concerned about the rising power bills in South Australia. Indeed, in the member for Grey's electorate, he has some of the biggest employers in the state. He has Arium, he has BHP and he has Nearstar. But it's not just the big employers that are affected by the higher prices, it's also some of the medium-sized employers like the Portside Hotel at Port Pirie. And they say if their power prices were more reasonable, they could employ 2 more people. That means 2 more bartenders, that means 2 more cleaners, that means 2 more chefs. That means the South Australian Labor Party is denying new jobs to the people of South Australia by the fact of their reckless energy policy, Mr Speaker, by their reckless energy policy. And that's why the Turnbull government has intervened in the gas market to ensure that we get more supply and that we get prices down. That's why we've taken steps through the parliament to pass a bill abolishing the limited merits review, to stop the networks gaming the system. We've got a better deal from the retailers for millions of Australians. We're investing in storage like the Upper Spencer Gulf Coltana project in the members' electorate, like on the York Peninsula with a 30-megawatt battery, Mr Speaker. And that's why we've accepted the advice of the Energy Security Board with the National Energy Guarantee, which will see an average household $300 a year better off than they would be under the Labor Party's emissions intensity scheme, and wholesale prices down by some 23%, Mr Speaker. Now, I'm asked, am I aware of any alternative approaches? Well, we know that in South Australia, Premier Weatherall conducted a big experiment. We know he conducted a big, dangerous experiment. And we know when the lights went out, the member for Port Adelaide called it a hiccup, Mr Speaker, a hiccup. So BHP lost over $100 million, and that was a hiccup, according to the member for Port Adelaide. And we know that South Australians, like at the Portside Hotel, are paying on average 20% more for their power prices than they are in other states, Mr Speaker. And that we know when it comes to hot summer months, South Australia relies more than ever on that connection cord to Victoria and coal-fired power from Victoria, Mr Speaker. And we know that they've had to wheel in expensive, polluting diesel generators that use up to 80,000 litres an hour just in case they need to keep the lights on, Mr Speaker. Now, if that wasn't all bad enough, the Leader of the Opposition, who vacates the chair when it gets a bit too tough for him, he wants to take the South Australian experiment national, Mr Speaker. a 50% renewable energy target, a reckless 45% emissions target. So don't look at what Labor says, look at what Labor does. Higher power prices is by Labor's name.
The member for Grayndler.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure. I refer to the government's own budget papers, which show that federal infrastructure investment in Tasmania will fall from $174 million this financial year to $53 million in 2019-20. Is this a reflection of the fact that not a single new federal-funded major infrastructure project has been commenced under either the Abbott or the Turnbull-Joyce governments?
Member for McMahon, the Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question, the member for Grayndler, and it is always a great honour to get a question from the member for Grayndler. He is no doubt very good at his job. He's across his brief, and I think he has great prospects in the near future within the Labor Party. Great prospect in the near future in the Labor Party.
Members on both sides.
The more, and I welcome to get many questions from him. I look forward. I think it's very proper that the Australian people see how the member for Grayndler performs. But it's interesting he says that there's no federal investment in capital infrastructure, because I was down there only recently seeing the dams and the water infrastructure that we are building. The dams and the water infrastructure that we are building. And I look forward to working with Freddie Hodgman in building further water infrastructure in Tasmania, and that's most definitely capital infrastructure, and it's most definitely in Tasmania. And also on the Midlands Highway, we are currently expending money, and I know that the people of Tasmania are looking forward to further growth in that, and we are very aware of the capital requirements of Tasmania, capital requirements on the Bass Highway, the Midlands Highway, the water infrastructure projects, because we are a government that builds infrastructure. We are a government that builds substantial infrastructure, and we are currently at work at Badger East Creek, inland rail. These things are vitally important. We have a vision. We have a vision. We have a vision.
Members
to make
on
sure
my
that
left.
we have a sealed road that goes from the top of Cape York to the bottom of the mainland, and then through bisecting Tasmania, because this is the sort of vision you have. We are not the philosophers on a log. We are the people who believe in infrastructure, and I look forward, to many questions from the future leader of the Labor Party.
The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Deputy Prime Minister's concluded his answer. The member for Grayndler will resume his seat. The member for Grayndler will resume his seat. The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Coalition Government is supporting the health of South Australians, including those in my electorate of Boothby? Is the Minister aware of any threats that may jeopardise the delivery of services for patients?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Boothby, who is a passionate advocate for the Flinders Medical Centre in her electorate, both as a graduate of Flinders University, but as somebody who, shortly after coming into this place, saw the tragedy of the statewide blackout and the impact of that on the Flinders Medical Centre. And I just remind the House of the headline in the Adelaide Advertiser at the time: 50 embryos belonging to 12 families lost in absolute tragedy at Flinders Medical Centre during statewide blackout. Now, fortunately, there have been some very strong developments in health that will benefit the people of South Australia in recent months. One, we've been able to contribute $110 million for youth mental health around the country, but in particular that will assist in South Australia. Two, record high GP billing rates in every state and territory, including an additional 22,000 GP services for the people of Boothby. And three, a new quad-strain meningococcal vaccine, which will help with at least 15,000 children every year in South Australia. Also, significantly, the Commonwealth has contributed, since coming in under this government, 26% increase in funding to South Australia's hospitals. This compares with the South Australian government's 6% increase over that same period of time. 26% under us, 6% under South Australian Labor. And what is very interesting, in the last year, the SA government had actually reduced funding to their own hospitals by $7 million. They've actually reduced funding to their own hospitals. And so I was asked whether there are any threats to the healthcare system in South Australia. 1, the South Australian government. 2, the South Australian government. And 3, the South Australian government. Because what else has happened? The second thing is, not only did Flinders Medical Centre lose power, but only just over a week ago the Royal Adelaide Hospital lost power at the hands of the South Australian government's own actions. What we saw was the lights go out during an operation on a 97-year-old because they couldn't keep the lights on. They couldn't keep the power going. And it was the president of the South Australian AMA who was operating at the time and who said this was unacceptable and that patients could die. That is what is happening in South Australia. Cuts to funding, the lights going out, and last Friday, whilst Western Australia signed up to the new Commonwealth Hospitals Agreement, Jay Weatherall turned his back on $1.5 billion. They've sold out the patients of South Australia, they can't keep the lights on, they've cut their own funding and they've turned their back on Commonwealth funding.
The member for Kingston.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Why is federal infrastructure funding for South Australia just $95 million in 2020-21, or just 2% of the federal infrastructure budget?
The Leader of the House will cease interjecting. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for her question, and might I say, let's start with the Osborne shipyard. I think that's about $1.5 billion. $1.5 billion they're spending there. In fact, South Australia has been the recipient under this government of one of the greatest forms of largesse that South Australia's ever got. Whether it's the offshore patrol vessels, the frigates, the submarines, Osborne Defence, there is a myriad of investment happening to South Australia. And might I commend the member for Sturt for his incredible advocacy for South Australia. In fact, you can hardly shut him up about South Australia. He's unstoppable about South Australia. And it's with that sort of advocacy that's brought forward this investment. And when we look at other things, I know that currently they're talking about the Strzelecki track, and we see that the north-south highway within Adelaide, there's investment there. South Australia has been a boom time under this government, a boom time of investment. There is just money flying out of Canberra, drebbing out of Canberra, running into South Australia. Whether it's investment in the Murray-Darling Basin plant, let's remember the $13 billion investment there, for which now we have the Leader of Opposition Business who's actually putting that at jeopardy. You should have a yarn to him about that. You should have a yarn to him about that investment in South Australia and where that goes if you reject the Northern Basin Review. So South Australia has been anything but left out by this federal government.
The member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of creating economic conditions that help grow the economy and reduce the tax burden on hard-working Australians? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches that pose a threat to the prosperity of hard-working Australians, exemplified by the good people of Goldstein?
The Minister for Revenue and Financial Services.
I thank the member for his question. The member, like the government, knows that the best way to improve the prosperity of all Australians is to foster economic conditions that allow businesses to grow, to invest and to create new jobs. That's why the government has already cut taxes for small and medium-sized businesses, employing over half of Australia's private sector workforce. And that includes more than 22,000 businesses in the member's own electorate of Goldstein. That's why the government is committed to reducing the company tax rate to 25% across the board. That's why the government is committed to reducing personal income tax cuts for middle-income Australians, having already legislated relief for more than 3 million Australians. And that is why the government has presided over the creation of more than 1 million jobs since we came to power. By contrast, the Leader of the Opposition, Bill Shorten and the Labor Party are intent on taxing the life out of the Australian economy by taxing it to the tune of more than $164 billion. Now, of course, we all know that the Leader of the Opposition holds a special place in his heart for the radical left Leader of the Opposition in the UK, none other than Jeremy Corbyn. We heard it. We heard it in his come to Jeremy moment at the National Press Club recently, where he appropriated almost word for word the divisive left-behind rhetoric used by his UK counterpart. Voters in the UK ultimately saw through this tactic, and of course Jeremy Corbyn was not successful, something that I'm sure will not be lost on those opposite. Yet, nevertheless, it leads one to wonder what other radical Corbyn proposals will the Leader of the Opposition seek to pilfer next. We're familiar with his resistance to reducing the company tax rate. Perhaps he'll go full Corbyn and look to increase the company tax rate by more than a third, as has been threatened in the UK. Perhaps he's partial to the proposal put forward by Corbyn acolyte and UK Labor MP Chris Williamson, who'd like to see a doubling of taxes on properties of over $500,000. Or maybe he's also taken with Mr Corbyn's other bright idea, introducing the highest tax rate of income tax at half of its current threshold, moving the threshold from £150,000 to £80,000. The Leader of the Opposition and the Labor Party are a threat to people's jobs, they're a threat to people's businesses, and they are a threat to people's economic opportunities. That is why the Leader of the Opposition and the Labor Party cannot be trusted.
The Minister's time has concluded. Member for Barton. The member for Solomon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Why do the budget papers show that of the $100 million allocated last financial year to the Northern Australian Roads program, only $12 million was actually invested, an 88% underspend in this area of great need?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call. Members on my left.
Well,
Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the honourable member for his question and note that the infrastructure that is being built in the Northern Territory, infrastructure that surrounds our issues in defence and defence of our nation. I also note the money that we put on the table, in excess of $100 million for the Outback Way, which substantially goes through the Northern Territory. And we look forward to working with a state Labor, with a Territory Labor government to make sure that we actually get that built. It's a vision of this government that we actually put that money on the table. $100 million as election promise, and also in excess of $20 million from our Northern Roads project. This is the sort of infrastructure that has a vision for our nation, sealing the third road from east to west across our nation. So long in the past we've just had one through Camberwell and one across the Nullarbor, but it is this government that is now sealing the third road. There's this government sealing the third road. And of course, if you want to have, with equity and with grant money, we're investing more in infrastructure than any government prior to us.
The member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Human Services and Minister assisting the Prime Minister for Digital Transformation. Will the Minister outline to the House how the government has worked to achieve savings of $1.4 billion in welfare payments through its fraud and compliance crackdown? Are there any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Human Services.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for North Sydney for that question. And he, like everyone on this side of the House, recognises that the welfare system only works and is sustainable when people get what they are entitled to, but nothing more. Now, this side of the House respects the Australian taxpayer, and we will not tolerate people defrauding our system, and where people have mistakenly overclaimed, we continue to expect them to repay that money. And because of the focus on compliance on this side of the House, from the 1st of July 2016 to the end of last year, we have achieved savings of $1.4 billion in welfare payments through a fraud and compliance crackdown. Now, we're not only recouping that money that was paid out to people who weren't entitled, we are increasing our efforts to remind people of their obligations to keep us up to date with their circumstances so they don't get into debt in the first place. Now, while the majority of people do the right thing, there are those who continue to set out to defraud the system and ripping off Australian families in the process. From the 1st of July 2016, my department investigated over 1,400 cases of potential welfare fraud and referred over 950 cases to the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecution for further action. Now, in the most serious of those cases, the perpetrators ended up in prison, an example of which being a person who claimed disability support pension that they weren't entitled to of over $160,000, and they were given 3 years in prison. Now, under this coalition government, if you're doing the wrong thing, if you're defrauding Australian taxpayers, we will find you and you will face the consequences of your actions. Now, I've been asked by the member for North Sydney about alternative approaches. Now, under the Labor government, compliance and integrity of the welfare system was clearly not a priority. The value of debts raised in the last year of the Howard government was $400 million. In the last year of the Rudd-Gillard governments, it was down to $200 million, a reduction of $200 million in the space of those 6 years. Now, the compliance checks that they conducted when they were in office were 16% of what we conduct today, and the amount recovered through tip-offs from the public was only 25% of what we recover today. Now, we are doing this through increasing our data matching program, which is 6 times what it was under the Labor Party. Now, we believe in this side of the House in the integrity of the welfare system. We believe you only get what you're entitled to, but we're the only party in this parliament that does.
The member for Grayndler.
Integrity Commission. Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, and I refer to his answers today in which he has defended Victoria receiving under 10% of federal infrastructure funding by mentioning funds that have been reallocated, argued Inland Rail would benefit Tasmania, defended South Australia receiving 2% of funds in his portfolio by talking about his colleagues' portfolio, and on the Northern Roads program being not spent, he referred to the Nullarbor. Isn't the Infrastructure Minister simply not up to the job that he has been given?
The member's time has expired. The Leader of the House has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker,
members on my left, the member for Lyons is warned.
Mr Speaker, members on this other side of the House are given a fair bit of licence, particularly the People's Choice, Mr Speaker. But how is that a question
I'm just
the
going
Deputy
to ask
Prime
the
Minister,
Leader of the
Mr.
House
Speaker?
to pause. He's been on perilous ground in not referring to members by their correct titles. I think I've heard enough of his point of order to rule on it. The question is completely in order.
Well,
the Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you
has the
very
call.
much, Mr Speaker. And I acknowledge the question because he's talking about people being not up to the job. And I know he's got someone well and truly in mind who he believes is not up to the job. He's not up to the job. And I think this is a great opportunity for the member for Grayndler to show his wares, to the Australian people and to show his wares to the member for Maribyrnong. I know when you're referring to not up to the job, that is actually a curriculum vitae for yourself. And I know that you understand more than most, that in equity and grant money we are spending vastly more than you did in infrastructure expenditure. And I know that you know better than most that you have no money on the table for the Inland Rail. We know that you have no money on the table for the Inland Rail. And I know that you know more than most that you're going to take money off the table for dams, that you do not believe in infrastructure. But I believe in you, the member for Grayndler. I believe in the member for Grayndler. All of Australia believes in the member for Grayndler. We're in there rooting for the member for Grayndler. Good luck, old mate.
Just before I call the member for Dunkley, members could cease interjecting, please, including the member for Griffith, as always. I'd like to inform the House that we also have joining us in the gallery this afternoon the Honourable William Tongamp, Governor of Jiwaka, Papua New Guinea. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you. Welcome to the House. The member for Duncan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on the government's reforms of the 457 visa class and how these changes are helping to secure jobs for Australian workers? Why is it important to support Australian jobs and Australian skills?
The Minister for Citizenship.
Well, can I thank the member for Dunkley for his question and his interest in this area. Mr Speaker, as members would be aware that last year the government announced significant changes to the 457 visa class in order to put Australian workers first when it comes to Australian jobs. And so, for example, we've already reduced the number of eligible occupations on the skills shortage list from 651 down to 461 to ensure that overseas workers are only brought in when there's genuine skills needs. We're about to introduce new rules for how jobs must be advertised so that Aussies get the first chance at those jobs. And further, we're investing in the Skilling Australian Fund, which will generate about 300,000 apprentices and traineeships going towards areas where there are skills shortages today. And, Mr Speaker, I can report that these things are already having an impact, because the most recent data shows that the number of 457s granted last year was only 70,000, and that's almost half the number that was granted compared to the last year of the Labor governments. And this is particularly impressive, Mr Speaker, because while we'd only granted half the number of 457s, we'd massively grown the economy and the number of jobs, as we've heard from by the Prime Minister and Treasurer, and equally the number of people on welfare had also shrunk to its lowest levels in 25 years. So we've seen it's a great trifecta of more jobs, fewer people on welfare, and consequently fewer overseas workers needing to come into the country to fulfil those unskilled, to fulfil those positions. That's a great trifecta for Australian workers, Mr Speaker. And it's interesting to contrast that with the Labor years, and you go through, because whereas we created the positive trifecta of more jobs, more Aussies in those jobs and fewer overseas workers coming into the country, the exact opposite occurred under the Labor government. So let's go through each one. You start with the job creation. Well, believe it or not, in the last year of the Labor government, the jobs actually declined, actually went backwards by over 17,000 people. You look at the welfare queues. The welfare queues increased by 250,000 people under the previous Labor government. And then, while that's happening, how many 457s came in? A record number of 130,000 457s came in. More people on welfare, more overseas workers coming in to take the jobs, and fewer Aussies taking those jobs. And guess who was in charge of that program? None other than the Leader of the Opposition.
The Minister's time has concluded. The member for Perth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Revenue. I refer to reports that a group of government backbenchers, known as the Parliamentary Friends of Payday Lending, have enlisted the Treasurer to water down the Minister for Revenue's payday lending legislation. Why is this government protecting unscrupulous operators in the payday lending industry by watering down this important legislation instead of protecting vulnerable Australians who are already doing it tough?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. As the matter falls to my portfolio responsibility, I can inform the member that the report is entirely false.
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. The Treasurer has the call.
Happy to repeat it again. As the matter falls within my portfolio responsibilities, I can inform the House that that report is false.
The member for Bowman.
Look, thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Urban Infrastructure and Cities, representing the Minister for Communications. Look, will the minister update the House as to how the government is working to ensure that the NBN is affordable to consumers and businesses? And is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Urban Infrastructure has the call.
Well, I do thank the member for Bowman for his question, because he has a strong interest in the national broadband network. He has a strong interest in seeing it delivered, and he has a strong interest in seeing it delivered affordably. And that is something that the Labor Party demonstrably has no track record in achieving. In fact, their plan would have seen the total cost of the NBN be some $30 billion, more than it is going to be under the Coalition's plan. And of course that would feed through to higher prices to consumers. Now, on this side we are committed to affordability, and we are very conscious of cost of living issues, and that is one of the reasons why we varied the rollout strategy to make it as affordable as possible. And pleasingly, the NBN has recently made changes to the NBN wholesale pricing structure aimed at improving the services offered to consumers and keeping costs low. And the ACCC has recently released a report which found that the new wholesale pricing has resulted in a 37% boost to the amount of broadband capacity that internet retailers are delivering to users. Now, I'm asked if there are any alternative approaches. Well, there would, of course, be the approach that we had from the other side of the chamber, who had 6 years in charge of the NBN. 6 years in charge of the NBN, that's a very long time, and yet when they left government, barely 300,000 premises around the country were able to connect. Today, the number of premises in areas ready for service is 7,235,000. On the one hand, 300,000. On the other hand, 7,235,000. And it's worth focusing for a moment on some of the areas that missed out. Some of the areas that missed out after Labor's 6 years of glowing promises, bold promises about the NBN. You know, in the member for Adelaide's electorate, in September 2013, you know how many premises were connected? Zero. Zero. In the member for Griffith's electorate, how many premises were connected? Zero. In the member for Jagga's electorate, how many premises were connected? Zero. In the member for Hindmarsh's electorate, actually it was one. One. But there is one other member who briefly had responsibility for the national broadband network in the land of Albonia. The total number of premises connected in Grainlaw was zero. When Labor
the minister's
left
time has
and
concluded. The minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the House, the member for Oxley, has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Revenue. 2 years ago, the government received a report which confirmed that vulnerable Australians already struggling to get by are being ripped off by unscrupulous payday lenders who charge massive interest and leave people on crippling debt they don't have a chance of repaying. 2 years on from this report, with vulnerable Australians still being exploited, why has the minister failed to introduce legislation to end dodgy behaviour in this industry?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker.
Treasurer has the call.
The portfolio matters that the member refers to are actually the responsibility of the Assistant Minister of the Treasurer, who I represent in this House. And the matters which the member refers to continue to have the very close attention of government. This government is very concerned about the impacts on people on low incomes to ensure that they do not get themselves into greater difficulty. But I'll say this to the member. Under this government, there are less people today of working age who are dependent on welfare than in the last 25 years. That's what we're doing for people who are under financial pressure. We're getting them a job, Mr Speaker. We're putting them in work. Over 400,000 people got a job under this government,
The
Mr.
Treasurer
Speaker.
will resume his seat. The member for Oxley is interjecting uncontrollably. If he opens his mouth once more during the Treasurer's answer, he'll be out.
Under this government, our most disadvantaged Australians are getting the best opportunity they could get, which is a job. A job is what transforms their lives. A job is what pulls them out of poverty. On this side of the House, we believe in a working nation. On that side, they believe in a welfare nation, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we know that Australians want to have the best of opportunity and do the right thing by their families and themselves by dragging themselves up and taking opportunity. On that side of the House, they had such a small vision, Mr. Speaker, of what Australians can do. On this side of the House, we believe in them, Mr. Speaker. We believe in what Australians want to achieve for themselves, and we're going to keep backing them every single day. 1,100 jobs a day were created last year under this government, Mr. Speaker, as more and more people went off the welfare queues and went onto the wage queues. And it's about time the Leader of the Opposition stopped standing in the way of a pay rise for those workers by allowing businesses to invest more in them rather than paying more tax to the government, Mr. Speaker. This is a government that is getting debt under control, that's getting the balance under control, is seeing wages go up, Mr. Speaker. That's what this government is doing. You should support us to create jobs.
The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yes, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.